I've 25 years plus teaching. We are in Virginia at this time. I've taught on 3 continents. From there, got my master's in special education. I've spent the majority of those years, those 25 plus years, in an alternative school with behavioral students. Students that don't like the word no and will pick up a chair. I have also served as a school board member in my community. I did 2 terms, and I came back in 2000 after our daughter was born in South Korea, and looking around, and it just seemed as though in that Midwest high school, there in Ohio, that it just seemed like things just seemed to be turning and changing. And that was like, whoa, what is going on here? And what made it even more profound to me was that this was in Ohio, Midwest, cornfields and just footballs on Friday night, and very conservative community of 8,000. And I started seeing things when I came back to substitute that something was just amiss. It wasn't the same high school that I graduated from. We moved to Virginia, and I'm in an alternative school. I would have to say somewhere around 2010, about. I started really fundamentally questioning a lot of things. But like a typical teacher, I'm thinking it's my fault. What is going on? You know, is it something I'm not doing, or am I too hard? So I started doing these different things, and I'm thinking, okay, what's wrong? What's wrong? And it dawned on me, it wasn't necessarily me as the educator, but my students were changing very, very incrementally each year, as far as resiliency skills. No one has resiliency skills. We're started to become afraid to fail at something. We couldn't handle being called a name. Not that I would encourage anyone to call anyone a name, but I mean, it's just we fall apart. And of course, society started changing even more, as far as expectations on schools. Schools have been changing for, everyone likes to think that schools have been changing for 20, 30 years, or they blame it on the last 2 election cycles. But what most people don't understand is that what you're seeing today is the accumulation of things that were put in place since 1830s all the way up. Some of us that are a little older, and we think about our education experience, we think, it wasn't that bad. I got a quality education. But even we don't understand that how we were educated really it is lacking. I've taken this puzzle apart generally and specifically. And I know that sometimes when I speak, I may sound a little conspiratorial, but you don't have to look too far out here to see where we are.
I was a public high school history teacher for about 12 years, and during that time became increasingly disillusioned kind of with a lot of, I'd say, systemic elements of the school system. And eventually, the kind of ideological, I would say, agenda kind of started to become more pronounced. It started probably around 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. And at that point, though, it was had kind of a very organic nature, meaning that it was it was kind of teacher-led. Teachers were making decisions about like what to bring into their classroom or what message. And yeah, they were, majority liberal, so that's kind of the message that got in there. But in 2020, with when George Floyd died, you had this kind of, I guess, call to action from school, not just my school districts, but school districts across the country, where they kind of now made things like diversity, equity, and inclusion their kind of official, agenda. It wasn't a secret anymore. They weren't going to use, coded word. They were going to come right out and say, like, here's our kind of left-wing values and beliefs, and here's where we stand, and here's what we're going to do as a school district, which, is totally outside of the mission of a school, which is first and foremost really, to teach kids to read, to write, to do math, to be critical thinkers. And I'm not saying that there's no place, for ethics and morals in schools, but when it has a very, I had a real problem with the very specific ideological nature of it. Almost every American goes through the public school system. And if you want to, determine kind of the outcome of this country, the future we have, what type of society we live in, it's much easier to start with students, when their minds are still malleable, and use a centralized system, the public school system. Everyone has to go in and there isn't choice to do that, than it is to spend time trying to convince adults. It's really, I mean, it's ingenious. I guess today I describe myself as conservative, right leaning. I wasn't always that way. When I entered teaching in my early years, I was very much on the left. I think that working in the public school system kind of shook those foundations, forced me to reevaluate what I believed, because I had this kind of belief coming from college that, public schools were, kind of the beacons of democracy, and public schools are often held up as like the examples of government doing things right. Like, hey, well, like at least we got public school, at least we have the best public schools, and at least we, educate our kids. And once that kind of foundation was shaken, when I saw how dysfunctional things were, I started to question and a lot of other things, and eventually start to go in a more rightward direction.